The light was already failing when Yefim Karguin stopped moving. He had been walking down the frozen channel toward the mouth of the river, where the ice widened and flattened into the great grey plate of the delta, and the last of the sun sat low and red behind the snow, throwing everything into that blue half-dark that comes to the far north in the middle of the afternoon. He said afterward that he had smelled it before he saw it. Not the smell of an animal, not blood, not musk, not the wet fur reek of a bear. Something colder than that, something that reminded him, he said, of the inside of a cave in summer, of standing water under stone, of a place the sun had never once touched. And then he lifted his eyes from the ice, and it was there. It stood upright at the very edge of the river mouth, where the frozen channel opened onto the flat white expanse of the delta, and it was pale. That was the first thing he fixed on, and the thing he would repeat for the rest of his life. Pale. Not white like the snow around it, not the yellow white of old bone, but a dull, greyish paleness, the colour of a body drained of everything that had once moved through it. It was tall. He had no way to measure it, and no wish to, but he set it against the height of the willow scrub, half buried in drift behind it, and by that reckoning it stood more than twice the height of a man. It did not stoop. It did not crouch the way a bear crouches when it rises to look and sniff and drop again to all fours. It stood the way a man stands who has been waiting a long time and intends to wait longer. The shape of it was wrong in a way he could not put into words, and the men who later took down his account wrote that he kept reaching for comparisons and abandoning them. The shoulders were too high and too heavy, sloping up toward a head that seemed to sit low between them, as though it had no proper neck at all. The arms, if they were arms, hung long, longer than any arm should hang, nearly to the level of the knees, and they did not swing or shift. The whole mass of it was thick, swollen-looking, hulking, and yet Yefim insisted it did not look fat, and it did not look strong in the way a big animal looks strong. It looked heavy. It looked like something that weighed far more than its size could account for, as though it were made of wet stone dressed in pale hide. It made no sound. There was no breath steaming from it in that terrible cold, and he swore to this again and again, that in air so cold his own breath froze on his beard and the ice cracked and sang beneath him, no cloud of vapour rose from the thing at all. It stood in a cold that would kill a naked man in minutes, and it did not breathe. For a long moment neither of them moved, and then Yefim looked down. He looked down because a trapper's eyes go to the ground the way another man's go to a stranger's hands, and what he saw in the snow between himself and the thing was worse than the thing itself. There was a trail. A line of tracks came out of the flat, open snow of the delta and marched straight toward him, toward the place where he stood, deep, deliberate prints, each one pressed so far down into the crust that the snow had cracked and heaved up around its edges. He said each print was longer than his forearm. He said they were not the tracks of a bear, because a bear rolls its weight and leaves the long drag of its claws, and these did not roll and did not drag. They were set down flat and enormous and evenly spaced, one before the other, the stride between them far greater than any man could walk and greater than any bear could walk upright, the gait of something that covered ground the way a tall man crosses a room. And the tracks stopped. Not at his feet, not at the river's edge, not at the base of the pale thing standing before him. They stopped out in the open, in the middle of the unbroken flat of the delta, perhaps 40 paces from where he stood, in snow that ran smooth and undisturbed in every direction. One print, then the next print, deeper than the rest, as though whatever made it had pressed down hard to push off. And then nothing. No further print, no scuff, no drag, no scrape where something might have been dragged aside, no disturbance where something might have leapt. The last track sat in the snow with its cracked, heaved rim, and beyond it the crust lay perfect and untouched all the way to the horizon. Something had walked out of the empty snow, taken a line of enormous strides toward the mouth of the river, and at the 40th pace had simply ceased to be. its trail ending mid-stride in the open, as if the world had closed over it and left one final footprint pressed into the record like a full stop. And yet it stood before him. That is the part I keep returning to, the part that will not lie down, no matter how many times I read the account. The tracks that ended in the open snow did not reach the thing at the river mouth. There was clean, unmarked snow between the last print and the pale figure that watched him. It stood where no trail led and no trail left. It had arrived without walking the last of the distance, or it had walked it in a way that left no mark at all, and Yefim Karguin, alone on the ice at the end of the day, understood in that moment that he was looking at something that did not obey the plain arithmetic of weight and snow and step that had governed every living thing he had ever tracked in 40 years on the tundra. He did not run. He said a man does not run from such a thing, that his legs would not have carried him, and that some part of him knew running was the surest way to end. He stood, and it stood, and the red light died behind the snow, and the blue dark thickened until he could no longer be certain where the pale shape ended and the twilight began. And only then, when he could no longer see it clearly, did he begin, very slowly, to step backward up the frozen channel the way he had come. That is the encounter. That is the thing at the mouth of the river, standing in the snow at dusk with a trail behind it that stopped dead in open ground. Everything else, who Yefim was, why he was there, what came in the 3 nights that followed, and what happened to the report that carried his words before another hand drew a line through them, all of that comes after. But it begins here, with a pale, silent, upright giant, and 40 deep prints that lead out of nowhere and end in the middle of unbroken snow. To understand how a man came to be standing alone on that ice, you have to understand the shape of his life, and the shape of that winter, and the particular emptiness of the place where the Olenyok River loses itself in the ice of the Laptov Sea. Yefim Karguin was 51 years old in the winter the district ledger records only as the season of 1911 into 1912. He was a trapper of the old kind, a man who worked the delta channels for Arctic fox and the occasional wolverine, who ran a team of 6 dogs and a light sledge, and who wintered alone in a series of hunting camps strung out along the frozen distributaries far north of the last permanent settlement. He was not a young man given to fright, not a stranger to the country, not a drinker or a teller of tales. The men who knew him in Bulan described him, in the phrasing that survives, as sturdy and silent, a man who spoke little and complained less. That description matters. It is the reason his words were written down at all, and the reason, I think, that a later hand felt it necessary to draw a line through them. He had gone out onto the delta in the last week of November, when the ice was thick enough to bear a loaded sledge, and the fox pelts were at their finest. His camp was a low structure of driftwood and hide banked with snow, set on a rise of frozen ground, where one of the smaller channels of the Olenyok braids apart before reaching the sea. It is a flat, treeless, wind-hammered place, a place where the horizon is a single, unbroken line for a full turn of the compass, and where a standing figure can be seen from a very great distance across the snow. That geography, too, matters. When Yefim said he watched the thing for the length of a dying sunset, he was describing a sight line that the land itself makes possible. There was nothing between him and it. There was nothing anywhere for miles but ice and low snow and the pale, enormous sky. The date I can give you with more confidence than the year, because it survives twice. Yefim reckoned his encounter at the river mouth to the feast of St. Nicholas by the old calendar, which places it in the first week of December. The district ledger in Bulan, where his testimony was eventually copied, carries a clerk's marginal note assigning the report to the 19th of December, the day, presumably, that Yefim finally walked in off the ice and told his story to a man with a pen, Between those two dates lies the part of this account that I find hardest to read slowly, because it is the part in which Yefim was not simply a witness to a thing standing in the snow. He was, for 3 nights, the thing's neighbour. He did not, he said, sleep on the night of the encounter. He backed up the channel to his camp in the dark, barred his door with the sledge, and sat with his rifle across his knees and his 6 dogs picketed in the lee of the snowbank outside. And in the deepest part of that first night, the dogs went silent. Not frightened, he said, not howling, not straining at their lines, not doing any of the things dogs do when a bear or a wolf comes near a camp. Silent. He went out at first grey light and found the picket line intact, the stakes undisturbed, the snow around them smooth, and 2 of his 6 dogs simply gone. No blood, no drag marks. No sign of a struggle. 2 empty collars still buckled to the line, as though the animals had been lifted straight up and out of them without a sound. Around the camp, at a distance of perhaps 30 paces, ran the tracks. The same tracks. Deep, rounded, pressed far into snow that took his own weight only to the ankle, and spaced, this is the detail he returned to again and again, spaced far too widely for any bear that walks on this earth. He was a man who had measured 1,000 bear trails with his eye. A polar bear on the delta leaves a print he knew as well as his own hand, and a stride he could pace in his sleep. These prints were half again as deep and nearly twice as far apart, a walking stride longer than a running man's, and yet the snow between them was never once broken by a dragging paw or a stumble or the ordinary imperfection of a real animal covering real ground. The trail circled the camp once in the night and did not come closer than those 30 paces. It simply walked around him in the dark, patient and enormous, and took 2 of his dogs from the middle of the picket line without a whisper. The second night was the same. He kept a fire and did not sleep and heard nothing, and at dawn 2 more dogs were gone from an unbroken line, and the great circling trail lay a little closer to the door. The third night, he took the last 2 dogs inside with him, into the small, dark space of the hut, and he sat against the barred door with the animals shivering against his legs, and he listened. He heard, he said, no footfall. He heard, once, something lean against the outer wall of the hut, a slow, settling pressure, the way a great weight tests a structure, and then nothing more until light. In the morning, the 2 dogs inside were alive. The trail outside had circled the hut so close that one print was pressed against the very base of the wall. And beyond the camp, running north toward the frozen mouth of the river, the tracks marched away in a straight line and, at a place in the open flat where nothing stood and nothing sheltered, stopped, mid-stride. One last deep print, and then smooth snow to the horizon. He walked out that day. 2 dogs, a light sledge, 40 miles of frozen channel between him and the first human voice, and he did not look back, he said, until he was inside the walls of Boulogne. He gave his account to a district functionary. The record does not preserve the man's name clearly, only an initial and a surname beginning with the Cyrillic letter that transliterates as V, and that man wrote it down in full in the careful, incurious hand of a clerk recording a fur tally or a death or a boundary dispute. It is a plain document. There is no wildness in the prose. It reads as the testimony of a sober man describing impossible things in the flat vocabulary of a hunter, and it is precisely that flatness that has kept me returning to it for weeks, because someone, later, went back to that page. In an ink darker than the original and in a different, harder hand, a single line has been drawn diagonally through the whole of Yefim's testimony, not a deletion, not a correction, simply a cancellation, the gesture a bureaucrat makes over an entry he wishes to declare void. No note explains it, no signature owns it. And beneath the crossed-out account, the same later hand added a brief instruction that a survey party be sent north to the Olenyok mouth to verify the trapper's claim. That party, I can tell you, was assembled. Its dispatch is recorded. Its return is recorded. but the report it was ordered to file, the document that would have carried a second set of trained eyes to the place where 40 prints end in open snow, was never entered into the district record. There is a number reserved for it in the ledger's index. The number leads to a blank. So let me do now what I have avoided doing for 3 parts, because honesty demands it, and because you deserve to hear the case against everything I have told you. Let me try as hard as I can to make the thing go away. Let me be the skeptic. The first and strongest answer is a bear. A brown bear, Ursus arctos, driven from its den in the dead of a bad winter, starving, its fat reserves gone, hunting when it should have been sleeping. A hungry bear will rise onto its hind legs to see and to smell across flat ground, and a large male in the Lena Delta can stand nearly 9 feet with its forelimbs raised, pale in the low light because its winter coat catches the last of the sun, and because the human eye, at dusk, at distance, across snow, strips colour from everything and leaves only a looming vertical mass. A bear circling a camp for the smell of dogs and fish and man is not mysterious. It is the oldest story in the north, and a bear will take dogs, quietly, if it is skilled, snatching a chained animal and carrying it off before the others fully wake, which would account for the silence Yefim could never explain, the dogs gone without the single yelp that should have torn the night open. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it persuasive, because if I only gave you the parts that thrill me, I would be lying to you by omission. The bear explains the height. The bear explains the pallor. The bear explains the circling and the vanished dogs, and even the heaviness of the prints, because a heavy animal on frozen crust presses deep where a lighter one leaves nothing. Much of Yefim's night dissolves under this single ordinary word: a bear. Then there is the snow itself, and here the skeptic is on even firmer ground. Tracks in the Arctic do not behave the way tracks behave in a forest. Wind in the delta moves loose snow across the surface in a continuous low hiss, a process called saltation, and it can fill a footprint in minutes and scour a ridge bare in the same span. A line of prints crossing a wind-exposed flat can genuinely appear to stop dead, not because the maker stopped, but because the maker walked from soft snow onto a wind-glazed pan where nothing registers at all, hard sastrugi, polished by the wind to the density of pale stone, taking no impression from any foot. To a frightened man, the trail ends. In truth, the trail simply crosses onto ground that does not keep a record. This is real. I have stood on that kind of surface. You can jump on it and leave nothing. And then there is Yefim himself, a man alone for weeks, 40 miles from another voice, in the killing cold and the long dark, his food thinning, his dogs dying around him one by one from a cause he could not see. We know what isolation and cold do to the mind. We have a clinical vocabulary for it now. The hallucinations of hypothermia, the paradoxical terrors, the way a frostbitten and starving brain builds a coherent enemy out of wind and shadow because a coherent enemy is easier to survive than a meaningless death. A ruined man walks out of the ice with a ruined man's story, and a kind clerk writes it down, and a wiser official later crosses it out precisely because he understands what happened to the poor trapper on the Olenyok and sees no reason to send that shame into the permanent record. I have laid it out as fairly as I know how: a bear, the wind, and a broken mind. Take those 3 together, and almost all of it is answered. Almost. But I keep coming back to the prints, not the ones that faded, not the ones that thinned into wind-scoured glaze. The last one, because Yefim was not a townsman describing a blur. He was a man who had read snow every day of his working life, whose survival had depended since childhood on knowing the difference between a track a wind has erased and a track that simply ends. And what he described was not a trail that grew shallow and disappeared. It was a full-weight print, the deepest of the whole line, pressed into soft, unglazed snow, And then, beyond its leading edge, smooth, unbroken snow running clean to the horizon, snow that held his own boot prints perfectly when he walked out across it, snow soft enough to keep a record and yet keeping none. The wind cannot scour one print and leave the one beside it untouched. Saltation does not draw a clean stopping line across a flat and then lay down a fresh, soft field the far side of it. That is not how moving snow behaves. Wind erases gradually, from the edges in, from the exposed toward the sheltered. It does not amputate a trail at a single stride and leave everything after it pristine. And the bear does not help me here either. Grant the bear the height and the pallor and the stolen dogs, the bear still has to go somewhere. An animal that leaves 40 deepening prints across open ground does not evaporate at the 40th. It walks on, or it turns, or it doubles back, and it leaves the walking or the turning or the doubling written in the snow, because it weighs what it weighs and gravity does not pause. A bear that reached that last print would have had to keep pressing its mass into the same soft snow that took Yefim's boots without complaint. There is no den there. No open water to slip into, no rock, no ridge, no overhang, nothing to climb, nothing to swim, nothing to be carried off by. The delta at the Olenyok mouth in that place is as flat and as blank as a sheet of paper, and on a sheet of paper a line that stops must have a reason for stopping. So I am left, after weeks, with a very small and very hard residue. Strip away everything the skeptic rightly claims, and this remains. Something heavy enough to press deep prints stood at the end of a trail in soft snow, in the open, with nothing above it and nothing beside it, and did not take a 41st step in any direction. Nothing lifted it. There were no other marks, no drag, no disturbance, no sweep of anything vast coming down. Nothing carried it away. The snow beyond held Yefim's own weight faithfully minutes later. It did not walk on. It did not turn. It did not sink because the snow was shallow over frozen ground and a man could stand there. It was there, and then, at the precise plane of that last pressed print, it was not. That is the whole of it. That is what the crossed-out page describes and what the unfiled survey report was meant to confirm and, I suspect, why the survey report was never allowed to exist. Because there are two kinds of erasure in this story, and only one of them is mysterious. The bureaucratic one I understand completely. A hard hand draws a line through an embarrassment. A number in an index leads to a blank. A witness is quietly reclassified as a man the cold had broken, and the machinery of a district office closes over the thing the way water closes over a stone. That happens without conspiracy. It happens through tiredness and good sense and the ordinary reluctance of serious men to file impossible things. I can trace that erasure. I can almost forgive it. It is the other erasure I cannot follow. The one out on the flat, at dusk, where a trail of deep prints marches toward a frightened man and stops mid-stride in snow that would have kept the next step and did not receive it. Yefim walked 40 miles and told a clerk the plain truth in the flat vocabulary of a hunter, and a later hand crossed him out, and the second set of trained eyes that might have settled it forever was sent north and came back and said nothing that survives. So the question he carried out of the ice is still standing exactly where he left it, unanswered, at the end of those tracks. If nothing lifted it, and nothing carried it away, and it did not take one more step in any direction across open snow that would have held that step, then where did the thing at the end of those tracks go? I have sat with that question for the better part of a year, and I want to be honest with you about what it does to a person, because it is not the kind of question you solve and set down. It is the kind you carry. I have read Yefim's 14 lines in the district ledger so many times that I know the placement of every stroke, the way the clerk's pen thickened on the word for heavy, the way the crossing out was done not in anger, but in a single flat horizontal that a tired supervisor draws when he has decided a thing will not be spoken of again. I have looked for the survey party's names in the muster rolls of the following spring and found 3 of them reassigned to a coastal station and 1 of them, the youngest, simply gone from the record with no death entry and no transfer, which in that administration usually meant a man had left service without permission or had been quietly removed from a list because his account had become inconvenient. And I keep returning, against my own better judgment, to the flat itself, to the geometry of it, because that is where the whole thing lives or dies, and it will not die. A track is a sentence written by a body in motion. Every print is a word, and the words follow one another in a grammar that never lies, because a foot must come from somewhere and must go somewhere, and the snow keeps the record whether the animal wishes it or not. That is the entire reason trackers have trusted snow for 10,000 years. It cannot be bribed. It cannot be persuaded. It writes down exactly what pressed into it and in exactly what order. And what it wrote, that dusk at the river mouth, was a creature walking a straight and deliberate line toward a man, heavy, upright, unhurried, the prints deep and evenly spaced and driving forward with intent, and then, at one print, mid-stride, with the weight thrown forward onto the ball of the foot the way a foot is thrown when the next step is already committed, the sentence ends. Not trailing off, not softening into wind scour, ending, as if the next word had been reached for and there was nothing left to write it into. I have tried every physical answer a rational man is obliged to try. I have already given you the bear on its hind legs, and I have conceded what it explains, and I have shown you what it leaves standing. But there are subtler answers, and I owe them to you too. Could the wind have taken the continuing trail and left the earlier one? No, because wind does not erase selectively along a straight line and leave the boundary knife-sharp at a single print. Wind feathers, it drifts, it fills from the upwind side and scours from the down, and it does not stop at the edge of one footfall as if a door had closed. Could Yefim have walked out to the end of an old trail and then, in terror, imagined the thing that made it? Perhaps. But he described the creature standing at the terminus, pale and hulking against the last light, and he described watching it, not lunging, not fleeing, simply present and then absent. A man inventing a monster invents it charging or vanishing into the trees or rising up. He does not invent it standing still in an open field and then quietly ceasing, because that is not what fear paints. Fear paints motion. This was the opposite of motion. This was the world declining to continue a thing it had already begun. And here is the detail that has cost me the most sleep, the one I almost left out because I cannot make it serve any theory. Yefim told the clerk that after it was gone, he walked to the last print and stood in it. He put his own boot in the final heavy impression and turned in a full circle, and there was nothing, no disturbance, no drag. No scuff of a body settling or leaping, no melt, no blood, no fur, none of the small, honest debris that a real animal leaves smeared around the place it last stood, just the clean, deep print, and beyond its forward edge, 40 miles of unbroken snow that had held his own returning footsteps perfectly all the way back to the district office. The snow could hold a man. The snow would have held the next step. The snow was never given the next step. I said at the beginning that there are 2 erasures in this story, and only one of them is mysterious. I have made my peace with the paper one. I understand the hard, flat line through the ledger. I understand the survey report that was never allowed to be born. I understand how a serious institution digests an impossible thing not through malice, but through the simple, sane, damning refusal to write it down. That is how the record thins. Not with fire, not with locked vaults, with a shrug, with a reassignment, with a young surveyor's name lifted quietly off a list. If you go looking now, and I have told you the district and the decade and the shape of the ledger, you will find the crossing out, and you will find the blank where the confirmation should be, and you will understand precisely how the machinery closed over it. That erasure is human, and it is finishable, and it is nearly forgivable. The other one is not human, and it is not finished, and it stands out there still. Because everything that men did afterward, the line through the page, the survey that came back silent, the reclassification of a hunter into a man the cold had ruined, all of that is only the second closing of a door that had already closed once, out on the flat, at the 8th or 9th heavy print, where a walking thing stopped walking and did not go anywhere that walking, climbing, sinking, flying, or falling could account for. The bureaucracy erased the story of the thing. The flat erased the thing. So I leave you where Yefim was left, and where I have not been able to stop standing since I first read his 14 crossed-out lines. Dusk over the frozen delta, the last light going out of the snow. A pale, hulking shape upright at the river mouth, unhurried, unafraid, and a trail of deep, even prints marching toward a single frightened man, and then simply concluding in flat open snow that would have held one more step and was never asked to. It did not turn, it did not sink, it did not walk on. It was there, and then, at the precise plane of that final pressed print, it was not, and the snow, which cannot lie, and cannot be bribed, and keeps the record whether we wish it or not, recorded nothing beyond that edge at all. If nothing lifted it, if nothing carried it, if it did not take one more step across the open white that would have kept the mark of that step forever, then where, and I have no answer, and neither did the clerk, and neither did the men who were sent to look, where did the thing at the end of those tracks go?